All right, I am here with Sarah Sandelius. Um, I hope I pronounced that right.
Yep.
Sarah is the founder and CEO of the Ability Challenge, or ABC, a nonprofit launched in 2019 that partners with schools, districts, and networks to build authentically inclusive special education programs. Before starting ABC, Sarah spent over 15 years working at the intersection of law, policy, and education. She served as executive director of policy and student advocacy for the New York City Department of Education's Alternative Schools District, and then as senior counsel for litigation and policy, where she managed class action litigation and helped move 1,700 schools towards more equitable practices for students with disabilities. So, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. So, you spent years inside the NYC Department of Education, seeing special education from the compliance and litigation side. What did that experience teach you about the gap between a school being legally compliant and actually serving a student well?
Well, I guess I should back up a bit and say uh, that most of that time before when I was in the alternative school district, I was working with schools that don't look like traditional schools. And so it was this really interesting opportunity to actually see how we can answer the questions of how do we get to be legally compliant, but also think about how what's good for kids. And so the first thing that I saw was that gap that you talk about, and that there was a real gap in what people thought they needed to do in order to be compliant and what they were doing to serve kids. It was sort of an interesting first view into that world because the schools didn't look like traditional schools. And so we got to really think creatively about what does it mean when you have to implement an IEP that's an annual document, but you're in a correctional facility and the students might be there for 3 weeks. And so, being the lawyer with the background that I have, I was always questioning, well, why does it have to be that way? Why are we doing things this way? Who decided that it's always been done this way so that we have to do it again? Um, and then fast forward, moving into citywide programs for the legal office in the New York City Department of Education, where I was actually trying to help people get more legally compliant. I sort of came in with that lens of how do we bridge those two work streams, like what's legally compliant and what are students doing and accessing in school. And my work was really around like, can we do both of those things at the same time?
Wow, yeah, fascinating. I mean, it's yeah, there's like the compliance side versus serving students, and that's always a balance, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's been so many times when I've been talking to leaders and I've said, like, let's talk about what's happening with this student that, for whatever reason is coming up as needing some extra support. Let's look at the IEP. And the leader sort of looks at me like, what? Why would I do that? And I'm thinking, because that's the IEP team has sat around the table and decided that this is the types of services that are needed. So we should always go back to that document to really see what does this child need. And if the document's not representing that, then we should revise the document, bring the team together, and serve that kid well. But the connection there, I think the default for a lot of leaders is, well, that was my legal document. I checked the box. I did the thing.
Right. Just for
So now I can
compliance
go
and
forward and
okay, we're
solve,
done.
serve the kid. And
Right.
it's like, wait a minute. Let's If we use those documents, they may be box checking activities at the moment, but there are a whole lot of people who are spending a lot of time writing those documents and investing in making sure that those documents are actually reflective of what children need. So the more we can bring those out and the more we can point to them and use them as working documents, the more we can start to bridge that gap of like, oh, this isn't just a legal document that we checked the box. We did the annual review and then we put it in a folder somewhere.
Yeah. Did you ever have a situation where that like you had that kind of conversation and then there was a change, or there was a change in the way that the school leadership or the school faculty handled it, and then there was a meaningful impact on the student or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we have those conversations a lot because we'll always say, well, let's go back to the IEPs. So when we work with leaders, for example, to help them build school, like their whole school schedule, for example, we'll say, well, let's go back to the IEPs. Let's see how many sections of each class we need in high school, right? Like they have to triangulate how many kids need a specific service, where that service is going to be delivered, and then how many kids have credits, how many ninth graders need, ninth grade English, how many of those need a co-taught classroom, and they have to really be able to pull those things together. So the more we pull out IEPs in operational tasks that maybe aren't always considered to be relevant for special education, the more we can get people to start to have that mindset shift of like, oh, these are documents that we should be using all the time. One example is that we were working with high school right after COVID, and they were having trouble getting enough paraprofessionals to staff their students. I don't remember the exact number, but there was a shortage in that area. It was a sort of a semi-rural area, and there was a shortage of staff. And so, these are legally mandated services that are on IEPs that require kids to receive this service. And so the first thing we did was we went back to the IEPs and we looked at what was the IEP team talking about when they decided that this child needs the paraprofessional and why. Because oftentimes there's a disconnect in sort of that why, and we jump to, well, this child needs a person one-to-one for the entire school day. And we were able to really pull out from that review of all of the documents, how are we going to maximize the people that we had? And then where are we going to really triage for additional staffing support to make sure that the needs are met in the context of that staffing shortage? Because you can't like pull people out of nowhere. And so while they were trying to onboard and bring in new people into that role, we had to sort of provide coverage for young people. And so there were some places where we had two students who were sharing a para, for example, or a student who was getting different services while we were finding that para. Now, is that technically legally compliant for 100% of the day? Maybe not. But were those children still thriving in the environment? I think they were honestly a lot more likely to be doing that, because we were also then building a plan to help those students move toward more independence. I could talk about Paris for a very long time, but I think the example of like breaking it down into individual students, going back to the documents and saying like, what do these documents actually tell us about what kids need? And then making really smart decisions that maximize efficiencies in the school, but really start from a place of student need. That's most of the work that we do.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, yes, it's funny that tension between the compliance versus what needs to get done. So what was the moment that made you leave a stable career, a legal career, and then go to start the Ability Challenge from scratch?
So it's funny, I don't think I considered it leaving a stable legal career as much as um I moved my family from New York to the DC area, which is where I grew up. And I did it right before the 2016 election, like a week before the 2016 election. And we all
Oh
thought
yeah,
Washington was going to
it's
be a
strange.
very different place. But, after that, there was really this moment of, okay, where there's just some shifting happening and there's a lot of surprise. And so we ended up like, I ended up really taking a step back and saying, okay, I didn't have a job. So I was like, what do I do now? Everybody's moving around. And I should have known from being from DC that that's what happens when you have a change in your leader.
Yeah, changing of the guard. Yeah, everyone leaves.
But I started to consult. And so it really was like working for the city. Then I moved into consulting. And that was when I said, you know what, this is not just a New York challenge, right? Like we have a special education need beyond New York City, and it's an everywhere challenge. And so as I was consulting, I was also saying to myself, like, oh, there's something here around how do we actually help schools and school districts do this work better in a more meaningful way. And so I gradually just like, sometimes I like to say, like, I started to take myself as the consulting client and like just created the organization out of that work because it just was such a need that I was identifying across all of my consulting partners.
Oh, that's great. Love it. So your framework, Thrive framework, was shaped by feedback from over 1,000 educators. What was it that surprised you most when you started collecting the input from those educators?
It's a good question. So one of the things that I did when I first decided I was going to start something, I didn't know what it was at the time, but I ran a national survey. And I had this feeling like there was something going on with the amount of data that people were collecting for special education and the amount of data that they were using for special education. And like, again, talk about disconnects, right? In my experience, people were just collecting a ton of data and like they didn't even know why or what they were using it for, but they were so used to collecting all of that data that they were just like on autopilot almost. And so I ran this survey to try and get a sense of like, well, what are people actually using the data for? And is there something that's more helpful that we might be able to do with some of that data? And the thing that I learned that was what surprised me was that there was a huge, talk about another disconnect, there was a huge disconnect in the the things that people felt were important to improve special education and what the systems were at the school level to support those things. So let me get more specific. So this is like not even a data question. We threw this question in at the end, and this is the thing that surprised me the most. We asked, of these 6 things, what's the most important for you to improve the way special education is delivered at your school? And this was being targeted to national educators. I think we had like 600 respondents. And they said one of the top things was more time to collaborate with my peers. And then we asked them later on in the survey, do you have these things at your school? And one of the things was time to collaborate with your peers. And there was like 70% of the people said more time to collaborate with my peers is one of the ways in which special education could be improved in my school. And then something like 30% said they had time to collaborate. And that was really surprising to me because here I am thinking the thing that educators most want is a structural, systemic, operational, technical fix, right? This time to collaborate with their peers. And yet 70% of schools didn't have that. So that I think was one of the biggest surprises for me in building the Thrive framework.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting problem for school leaders. How do you find time for professional development? How do you find time for collaboration when teachers are teaching classes most of the day? Yeah, it's sort of a classic question. Were you able to see any improvements there in your work, like where people reported back, oh, they were able to get more collaboration time for teachers?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we help people do, I talked about the whole school schedule. We help leaders find the time to do that because it's so important. And if you look at what, lots of people have lots of things to say about special education and the law and what it says you have to do or not do. But if you look at if you're taking an optimistic approach and you look at what it's supposed to do, right? You're supposed to have a grade level content area teacher, right? Your general education teacher, and your special ed teacher who's trained in disability and how disability impacts learning. And so ideally, those two people are bringing expertise to the table that's different, training and expertise and the lens that's different. They have to have time to collaborate in order to make that system work. And yet there is no time in the day. And so we help leaders try to build that time. The other thing that we do is we do a lot of training for people on how do you actually co-plan, because we just assume that people know how to collaborate. But planning together is a skill, and they need a shared language. They need to be able to understand what both of those people are bringing to the table. They typically need some sort of an agenda. They need to know, basic understanding of what is special education and how it plays out in schools. So we do a lot of that work, both at the leader level and the educator level.
Fantastic. So you're based in Washington, D.C. How is working closely with the D.C., Maryland districts shape the way that you think about special education reform on a national level?
Yeah. So I'm one of those people who grew up in DC and got mad at everybody who said they were from DC and then they actually lived in Virginia or Maryland. And now I'm one of those people because I live in Maryland. So we're technically based in Maryland, but most of our school partnerships are in DC, or many of our school partnerships are in DC, and we've recently been growing to some other places outside of DC. I think the thing that's really interesting about DC as an ecosystem is that it's half charter school and half public school, and it's one district. So DCPS is the only district in the city. And so what it's enabled us to be able to do is to see a lot of innovation and unique qualities about the charter schools that you might not see in another city where, maybe school choice is not as big of an issue. We don't have an opinion about charter versus public. We work with everybody. But I think that having that small ecosystem that's so diverse has been a really interesting learning opportunity for me and for my team, in just thinking about how do we build on the economies of scale to make sure that we're lifting up all students, and not just one sector or one part of town or one different type of need.
Yeah, that's great. Are there specific policy or funding challenges that are unique to Washington, D.C. schools that you think other states could learn from, either as a model or maybe as something not to do?
Interesting question. So DC has a uniform funding formula that takes into account the level of need of a child. And so theoretically, the way it's supposed to work is, I guess, more need or more services. And for those who are listening to the podcast, I'm putting air quotes, attaches the student gets more money. Basically, the school that is serving the student gets more money. And so based on that, I think DC schools are relatively well funded for special education. I mean, I don't think anybody would say they have enough money to deliver on the special ed mandates that they have, but when you compare it to some other places, there is, a relative increase in the amount of money based on how many services young people need. I think what's hard about that then is that it possibly could de-incentivize inclusion. And so, I think all of the models have pluses and minuses around funding and how you get money into the hands of people who are making decisions. And DC isn't any different. But I do think their model is relatively good compared to, some others that I've seen.
Okay. So to talk about your work, you describe yourself as building anti-ableist schools. So what does that look like day to day inside of a classroom, and you know, in the real world, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, so when I started the Ability Challenge, that was the question, was like, tell me the model. Where is this being done well? What does special ed look like when it's being done well? And folks would be able to say like, oh, look at X school for this. You know, they do this thing really well, but maybe not this other thing. And so we built the Thrive framework because there didn't seem to be a universal understanding of like what is special education when it's done really, really well. Inclusive special education, and in a realistic way, right? Like we're dealing with schools that have the reality of no time, you know, money goes up and down, buildings are limited in terms of space. But so we built Thrive to really better understand what does effective inclusive special education look like. And so there is 5 core elements, and one of those elements is student-centered curriculum and instruction. All of the elements are related, right? Like, so the first element is culture. Culture is definitely related to student-centered curriculum and instruction. But in that element 2 of classrooms, we've really pulled out, I think, 6 or 7 of the most important evidence-based approaches for diverse learners. And so what we want to see is we want to see an environment that we walk in that every kid in the room knows what they're learning and why, for example, right? And it's not just the kid sitting in the front, it's the kid sitting in the back that knows those things. And you can tell that when you walk into a classroom and you sit there for 10 minutes. We want to see environments where every kid has access to the learning content. And so that could mean differentiated materials based on what we know a child might have challenges with, so that they can still get to the content, right? So if you have a reading challenge and you're in social studies class, it might mean that you have a different set of reading materials, but you're still engaging in the same lesson that the rest of the class is. It could mean peer-to-peer conversation, ideally not having the teacher talk for the whole time. There's just a bunch of different strategies that we know research has shown are really effective for providing access to instruction. And so those are the things that we hope to see when we go into classrooms.
Great. So ABC has a goal of 1 million more students with disabilities, getting 1 million more students with disabilities on track to graduate by 2045. So can you talk about that, how you measure progress towards that goal?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I will say it's that I don't think we've not mastered that answer to that question. So we're still working on it. And I think that part of what's hard around getting to the student level data is knowing that many children with disabilities are being tested in ways that don't show what they know, right? It shows really what they don't know, and or some of the tests are testing into areas of challenge where disability could present a barrier. So that same child that has trouble with reading, for example, then you put in front of them a test that requires it to be read, the whole thing. And, you know, you may or may not be testing the content knowledge that they have about whatever the thing that is being tested. And so I'm very cognizant of wanting to provide measures in ways that are student-centered and supportive. The closest I think we get is around growth, and what we've started moving toward is measuring the percentage of students who are meeting their growth goals, and trying to get more students meeting their growth goals, more students with disabilities meeting their growth goals on ELA and math than before we started working with schools. And so, if we can say that, then I think we're headed in the right direction. We also measure things like the change in adult behaviors as well as how many people we're working with. But we really want to see that change in kid access and outcomes.
Love it. Well, that's exciting. I look forward to hearing more about the progress there, and as you have that lofty challenge, and seeing it come and grow. So that's all the time we have. Thanks so much, Sarah. It's great to talk to you today, and best of luck with the Ability Challenge.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.